All right, welcome back to our third hour here. All right, so let's just cover off something which seems to have a bit of confusion out there. So let's just put this out of the way for a minute. All right, so what is the login process when a user logs into the environment? All right, so the first thing they're going to do is they're going to put in their username. All right, so they put their username into the website. So what happens there? Well, what happens there is that the username is checked against Azure AD. Okay, does the user name appear in Azure AD? If you type a username that doesn't exist, you'll get a prompt and you can't go any further. So again, the first thing it does is it verifies that the username exists in Azure AD. The next step then is to put in the password. Again, what happens is that the hash of the password, or basically the password signature, is then compared or verified against what is in Azure AD. All right, so again, if that then matches, right, we move on to the next stage of the user login. The next stage then basically should be MFA. All right, so again, what happens here is we're going to get it from our app, right? So we're going to make sure that our app matches our MFA. So username, password, MFA. Now, the next thing that's evaluated is conditional access. All right, so conditional access will look at a couple of things here, potentially. It will look at the location, right? Is the login from Australia, right? Is the login on a compliant device, right? So this is where that compliant policy kicks in. Oops, let's move that across for you. All right, so conditional access is then evaluated. Right, is the device located in Australia? Is the device a compliant device? Then, if it passes conditional access, it will then come in, and the next thing it will do, it will reevaluate or confirm the compliance. So now that the device has logged in, it will verify that the device is compliant. Once it's finished evaluating the compliance policy, the next thing it's going to do, which is what we're about to talk about, is it will then implement a configuration policy. Okay, only at this point are changes made. Right, all the other ones over here are simply effectively just doing a read. Right, so this is effectively a read or a verify operation. Verify. Okay, so the only thing that starts changing things is our configuration policy, which we are about to talk about. Okay, is that clear enough for people? Answers that anybody's question there as to what happens and how it works? Please give me a thumbs up to let me know that it's all good. All right. So with that said, let us move on to talking about configuration policies, right? So this is now where we're going to be able to make changes and enforce configuration on our devices. Okay, so we've gone through all that. Okay, now strangely enough, these are also found in the endpoint manager under devices under the configuration profiles. Now we can also view a summary of those in the, that's the compliance status, under the compliance profiles, and you'll see here that to create a profile, it's very similar to what we've talked about with compliance. You simply create a profile, select a template for your operating system, and then go in and configure the appropriate settings. And again, rather than looking at slides, we go into our devices, we go into our configuration profiles, right? We're finished with our compliance. You'll see here that I'll go and create a profile. And I will select a platform. Again, we'll keep it to Windows 10, but you can target it at any operating system. And now I can select from templates. I'll come back to the settings catalog shortly. And I can choose, for example, any of these policies. So let's go in and select maybe device restrictions. And this will give us a number of settings. So if we go in here, Win 10 device restrictions. And these are all now the settings that we can make for this device, right? So what we can do in here is, let's find one. What have we got in general here maybe? So maybe I want to block removable storage. So I don't want the capability to use USB storage. So I want to block that. And maybe I want to block USB connection, maybe want to get rid of Cortana, for example, and so on. So I now save this. Once again, you'll see that I can target it to all groups, users, and devices here. So I can add all my devices if I want, my Windows 10 devices. So I'll select that and go next. Again, I can also set up some applicability rules here if I want, but we'll move through that. And the policy is now good to go. So once I've set up that policy, that configuration policy, you'll see it appears here. If I want to go in and edit it, I simply click on it. You'll see that I can go into the properties. I can go in and edit any of the options here. So I can edit any of the configuration options here and maybe add something, not the printer one, what about the password one? All right, so again, require a password. I can update any of this and save it, and then that will give me the updated policy. Now, underneath here, you'll be able to see when it's been rolled out to any of my devices. At the moment, they're pending. They haven't checked in to pick up this new policy yet. Again, we can look at the users that are logged into those devices rather than devices, and we can look at the per device settings. So we can go in and drill in if there are any errors. Now, the important thing to notice here is when I create a profile on a platform, you'll see here that I have lots and lots of templates. So you'll see I get admin templates, custom templates, device restrictions, identity protection, endpoint protection. So let's go in and just show you the variation. So if I go into endpoint protection, so I go in here and go Win 10 endpoint protection. Go next. You'll see that this template has a number of different settings. Here is where I would go in and configure the firewall settings. All right, so those people that were asking about the firewall settings, this is where you would go in and enable and set up that. And when the policy is applied, it will then be applied to the devices that you have nominated. Now, as you can appreciate probably, is going in here and creating a profile and then selecting from the first template, the second template, the third template is quite an onerous task, right? It's going to take a lot of time to do. So what Microsoft has done is they've created this concept of a settings catalog. So the settings catalog has taken all the settings and put it in one location. Whoops, Windows 10 settings cat has taken all the individual templated options and put it into a single catalog. So now what I can do is simply select the option here and do a search for firewall, and it will now find any instance of that throughout all of those templates. So now I can basically go in and pick the ones that I want here, okay, that suit my environment. So enable that, enable packet queue, No, actually, I don't want to do that one. I want to do, that's fine. And then basically that will then add it to this policy for me and allow me to turn these on and off directly. So rather than creating individual templates with the standard settings that are only available in that template, I can use the settings catalog to create a custom policy that includes as many of those settings as I want. So instead of having 5 templated policies, you could have one settings catalog policy with all those settings inside that location. So the choice is yours now, but the trend basically is going to be towards the settings catalog. So the templates are being phased out. They're still there. My advice to you is to look at the settings catalog. Brendan's asking about, are they nested? I don't know what you're talking about when you mean, are they nested? The settings are applied when the policy applies. So when the policy is pushed down to the device, the settings are then applied to that environment. I'm not quite sure what you mean by nested. So if you want to clarify that. Okay, so we'll deal with conflicting policies later. But the idea here is to make sure that obviously you get the right settings and you don't start creating duplicates. And that's why you do need that area of planning. We'll talk about conflicts in the troubleshooting area, but for this point in time, just let's assume that we're just going to apply the policies as they are, and they're all going to have one setting. They're all going to match one for one. So there's no conflicts, but we will come to that later. All right, so the idea is, like I said, go into your devices, go into your configuration profiles. Now, if I create a profile, for example, let's go in here and do one for iOS. You'll see that I get the same sort of templated options. There's no settings catalog yet for iOS. So let's go into restrictions for iOS and again, give this a nice name so I know what it is. iOS restrictions. And you'll see here I get lots and lots of options in there. So I go to lock experience and say, block control center access to lock screen, block notifications. I go yes. And these will then be pushed out to any Apple iOS device that matches the assignments that I put onto it. So if a user that I've selected in that group has an iOS device, that policy will be applied to iOS and change any of the configurations that I have for you, that I have set there. So if we step back here and take a think about this, there's a lot of work here, right? Because we've got to set compliance policies for every single operating system at least. Then we need to set configuration policies, and there could be 15 or 20 different templates with hundreds of different individual settings inside that. And we need to do that for each operating system. So again, it's very similar to group policy in its approach, but we've now extended that to include iOS and Android and Mac as well. And this is why it's very important to have good documentation and to have a good naming convention. So pick a naming convention for your policies that makes sense and it's easy to troubleshoot, because when you do get conflicts, you want to make sure you can identify which policy is causing or where the conflict is coming from. So again, take a moment to maintain good documentation, what you're setting, what you're turning on, what you're turning off, but also a good naming convention so you are able to troubleshoot this quickly and easily. And it does help to put things in the description and use as many characters as you see fit there. So the idea here is, as mentioned, is the user will download, for example, Office Mobile and sign into Office 365. The device will then be identified as not enrolled. They will then go through an enrollment process. So this is, again, an iOS environment. The user will then have to follow through the enrollment capabilities or the steps involved in the iOS device. That will then basically push that policy to that device after they've completed that enrollment, and then it will then identify whether the device is compliant. So once it's joined, it'll be evaluated for compliance. If it's compliance, then allow the device to access information in Office 365. Right, so the very first step is doing a join to Azure AD in whatever way, shape, or form. Then having a compliance policy applied and evaluated to allow access, and then the configuration policy kicks in, and then access to the data the user has requested. So that is the flow-through process that it goes through there. And remember that we had to create an Apple certificate to do MDM with our Apple devices. We had to set up compliance policies, which we talked about, and then we had to set up the device profile or the device configuration policies, and they would set low-level, firewall, operating system level, lock screen, passwords, PIN numbers, all that sort of stuff. So this is everything we've talked about so far is MDM, device management for iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows machines as well. All right, so this basically covers off the majority of the MDM situation. We're about to get into MAM, application management. All right, are there any questions on device management before we move to application management? Okay, so Jamf recommends one policy per payload. Does Windows recommend the same? As I would tell you, my advice to you is the less policies, the simpler you have, the easier it's going to be. You can have as many policies as you want. I've seen environments where they've got 50, 60 policies per device. All right, my advice to you is the simpler it is, the easier it is to manage, the easier it is to troubleshoot. Can you do more? Absolutely, not a problem. But it's more about managing it than overloading the system. So again, best practice is the minimum amount of policies you need to do to get the job done. Devices that are already joined to Azure AD, what's the easiest way to enroll them? Well, firstly, you'll need to have Intune. You'll need to have Intune licenses. And again, if you're adding Intune licenses after the fact, then you're going to have to go in and do the enrollment probably manually or unjoin and rejoin. But if we go in here and have a look in our standalone machine here, you will see that there is also, I think there should still be the capability here, or has it been removed? Where are we? Yeah, it might have been removed. Okay. Let's just go in here. Yeah. So basically, when I've still got a standalone machine here, you'll see that there's an option that allows me to do a manual join, a manual enrollment. So if you've already got licenses that are Azure AD, you add Intune, and then they would need to go through that manual enrollment process, which you can, again, force on them. So you can force them to automatically enroll every time they try to go to Office 365 data. So that's probably the easiest way, is that when they try and access Office 365, they'll be taken through an enrollment process, or you can, click a couple of buttons and do it manually beforehand. So it is possible, but generally you force them to enroll once you've got the Intune licenses, once they need to access Office 365 data. Okay. So yeah. What's that picture? Yeah. So again, that screen that you've put in there. Thanks, Ivana. So basically that's the option there to enroll only in device management. So that's typically how you would do it manually if you wanted to, but the best way to do it is to use conditional access and force the user to go through enrollment when they want to try and get to their Office 365 data. But if you wanted to, you could do it manually like that. Are the policies inside config profile templates overlapping? Again, not quite sure what you mean with that. And I think you're referring to the conflicting stuff. And as I said, we're pushing off the conflicting stuff to the troubleshooting discussion down the track, right? So again, we're assuming one-to-one with no issues. We'll come back to troubleshooting later on. We do a lot of OneDrive ADML. Cadence policies, auto enroll, SharePoint yes. So if you have a look at enterprise, where are we? Go back to my virtual machine. Okay, so the way that you would do that, or one of the ways that you can do that, again, if we go into our configuration profiles, create a profile, go into our settings catalog. Okay, so go in here, go into Windows 10, go into settings catalog, go create, and let's go in here, settings catalog. And you'll see in here that if I add a setting and do a search for OneDrive, I get a whole range of options that are available to me. Right, so there's OneDrive. Okay, and you'll see that there are all the options that are available to you. So the answer is yes, more than anything on-prem, that's for sure. So yes, it's got far more power than what you would see typically on-prem when it comes to policies for things like OneDrive. Any other questions? Before we move on to MAM, right? So we've talked about MDM. We want to talk about MAM, which is the application management side of the house here. Okay. Right. Okay, so let me just move my screens around a bit. All right, so once we've done our MDM on the machines that we want to do MDM on, we can now do MAM. Now remember that MAM can be applied to joined, registered, and standalone machines, right? Our endpoint manager, our MDM required enrollment. So only Azure AD joined machines could do MDM. That's a prerequisite of using the MDM capability, is you need to enroll it. MAM is not that at all. It's just dealing with the applications one at a time. Okay, so that's the big difference here. So all devices can go through MAM. Now you find the application management as mentioned here under apps, and then the first place to start is the app protection policies. All right, so if we go in and have a look at our thing here, we go into apps. Okay, so you'll see here that we have a list of applications, and we can go in and add any application that we want from the store, from whatever that we want here. Now, what we're doing here is we're defining our corporate applications, right? So what we want to define here inside our endpoint manager is what we consider to be corporate apps. Now, corporate apps will access corporate data. Now, obviously, they're typically going to be Microsoft apps out of the box, but they may be things like Adobe, they may be, other third-party applications. But the idea here is you don't define every app, you're just defining what are the business apps, right? What are the corporate apps, okay? The first thing that we would apply here is a protection policy, right? This is going to protect our data. Now, when we select this, once again, we need to pick the operating system. So let's go to Windows 10 here and put in Windows Win 10 app protection. And you'll see now that I can now select between with enrollment and without enrollment. So with enrollment is MDM, right? Azure AD joined or Azure AD registered. And we can also do it without enrollment, which is just pure, Windows 10 Home or whatever, without having to enroll any of the devices. So let's go without enrollment in this case. Let's go next. Now, we need to tell this policy what applications is it going to apply to. So what applications are going to be part of this policy? All right, so what we're going to do first is we're going to basically add our protected apps. So these are our corporate apps. So these are the ones that are suggested. Obviously, they're typically all Microsoft apps. So these are our recommended apps. So we can select those. You'll see up the top here that we can also select store apps and desktop apps too if we want. Let's just take the recommended ones for the time being. So now it is going to go in and add those as a list of apps that are considered corporate apps, right? These are the apps that will work with and be allowed to access corporate data. Now, what we can do down the bottom is we can also exempt apps if we want. So we can exempt apps from these policies. Now, what sort of application may you want to exempt from a policy? Well, if you're using a third-party browser, you may want to exempt that from an application protection policy, right? You may want to choose a different sort of PDF reader and have that exempt from this policy. So remember, targeted apps are going to be able to manipulate and work with both corporate and private data. The exempt apps, right, are going to, depending on the policy, do the same, and then anything else is only going to be able to work on personal data. Now, the next step here is to manage how the information is used. Now, Microsoft uses something called Windows Information Protection. Now, Windows Information Protection, think of this as a way to protect the location where that corporate data is stored. So this is going to say, okay, any targeted app is protected and is good and allowed to work with data. Anything that's not in that list will be considered a private app. Now, how do we want to handle that? How that is handled is done via Windows Information Protection. So, for example, here you'll see that, do you want it to be turned off, to be silent, which is auditing? Do you want to allow override where the user's prompted, or do you want to block? So what that means is that if I set that to block, I'm not going to be able to take information that comes from one of those apps in the list and move it, copy it, change it, or work with it in any other app that isn't in that list, right? So the prevention of copy and paste between a corporate app and a non-corporate app is handled by a technology called Windows Information Protection. And you can choose whether that's off, audit, prompt, or enforced, okay? So in this case, I'll select it to allow override for the time being. And next, I can go in here and define not only, so the first thing in our policy is we define the applications that work with data, corporate data, but we can also define locations here. So what we can do is we can go in and define a location, a boundary, which is a cloud resource, a domain, a proxy, an IP4 range. So generally what you would have in here is you would have, for example, actually SharePoint's probably a better one. You would put in here, SharePoint, and then what you would say is it will be star.sharepoint.com. So what that means is that it's saying that the data in anything SharePoint.com is considered corporate data. So we defined the corporate apps in the first step, and this step we are now defining where the corporate data lives. Where's the boundary of where that data is? Now, typically it's going to be in the cloud, Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, Yammer, all that sort of stuff. But as you'll see here, you can also define it to be on-prem and also any IP range. Now, again, you need to be very careful if you do that. So my cautionary tale is that, as I learned, you don't go and define your local environment with this initially. So what happened is that I got really excited about this. I set up my local, I've got a Windows storage server that I used to use as a sort of a NAS box. So I defined that as being corporate data, defined my corporate apps, all worked really well until I needed to use TrueCrypt to unlock a protected data file that I had. So I couldn't use TrueCrypt to open the corporate data because the corporate data lived on a protected IP range, which considered it to be corporate data, and I hadn't defined TrueCrypt, the application, as a trusted corporate app, so therefore that could not open my corporate data, and that was very painful, and I had to change the policy and then force it to sync and wait it to finish sync. So again, be very careful when you implement these to understand what it does and the impact it has, but it is very, very far reaching in what you can achieve. So it's not purely limited to cloud. It can also, again, be extended to on-prem if you wish. All right, so you'll see in here that we can also, for example, define data recovery, because Windows Information Protection will make will make sure that the corporate data is always stored encrypted at rest. So this goes back to the item where I talked about a work from home environment where the user synchronizes their OneDrive for Business data back down to their local machine, right, without having the machine managed. Windows Information Protection will ensure that that data on that unmanaged machine is protected with a unique encryption, and it's encrypted within that OneDrive area, even if the disk underneath it is not encrypted. So again, that's the real power of it. So lots of little options in there, more advanced. I won't go into those in detail. I then go in, this is good. Again, assign it to a group. So in this time I would go in and, target my users, say, go select, go next, and there's my app protection policy. Now we can have an app protection policy for, Windows 10, iOS, and Android. We can have it for a different set of users, management, field staff. Again, it's all down to policy and how you wish to go in and configure this. So we've started talking about application management. So the first thing to do was to obviously go in and define any applications, typically those outside the Microsoft space that you may need in there. And then the next thing we've done is gone in and created a protection policy. From there, we will go in and look at the configuration policies as well. So that's how we set up individual settings inside those applications and make sure that they're pushed out appropriately to devices. But the first one is what protection do we want to apply to applications that are accessing corporate data? And we do that with an app protection policy. Are there any questions on that? So any questions on the first step in MAM, which was application protection policies? Again, if there aren't any questions, just give us a thumbs up. Let me know that you're following along and I can continue on. Okay. All right, so that is the application protection. Once we've done application protection, our next option is a configuration policy. So much like MDM, okay, we can go in and we can configure the configuration of each of the applications that we've defined as corporate applications. Now, again, same area, apps, and we look at app configuration policies. If we select that, you'll then see that there are lots of options. So rather than looking at a slide, let us go and find those. Go to app configuration policies there. Go into add, go into manage devices or managed apps. So let's do managed apps. Let's call this, I don't know, iOS, maybe Outlook. Okay, oops, okay. And you'll see here I can select the apps, right? So all apps, Microsoft apps, core apps, or I can select an app here. So let's go in here and do a look for, Outlook on iOS. There's Outlook, select that. Again, you've got the option to do custom apps if you want. So let's go next. Now we can go in and do the settings here. So these are the Outlook configuration settings. Do we want focused inbox? No, we don't want focused inbox. Nobody likes that. So we can turn off focused inbox. We can then assign that once again to our groups. We'll stick it in our device users again. And then that will then apply that configuration for that app to that environment. All right, so it's really as simple as that. So looks very simple, but remember here, we're going to have to do that for every application. We're going to have to do it for iOS, for Android, Outlook for iOS, Outlook for Android, Outlook for Windows, through all of that. So MAM sounds good, but MAM configuration can be quite challenging. So again, keep that in mind. It is there, it is capable. You can get quite granular with all these settings, but all of them require setup, management, and maintenance down the track as well. So a question from Akshay. Do best practices need to have app protection policies defined? No. none of this that I've shown you has to be implemented. It's your choice. Okay, so what's your best practice? Right, that's what you need to decide. Now, as we get through all this and we've done all the mechanics of it, I will talk about the recommended best practices that you should abide by. But at the end of the day, you can do as little or as much as you see fit. And again, that's the value add that you provide, you know, to these basically to these sort of environments. All right. Are there any other questions there? We are getting towards time. I think we probably need to take a break since we were a bit over last time. Let us see. Any other questions? Any other questions? Are we good to take a break so that I can come back and give you a bit more of a demo that'll take a minute or two to set up? Can you import and export app? You can import and export everything, and I'll show you that. I've done that with PowerShell, so yes, it is possible. You can absolutely import and export if you want, but typically you're going to have to use a script to do that. There isn't any native capability at this stage to achieve that. When can we add XML in app config policy? Not quite sure what you mean there. You can use, if you use PowerShell, you can use XML. That's how you would describe the files are all in XML. So not quite sure what you mean by add XML and app configuration policy there, but it can support XML if you're talking about the definitions of the policy. Any other questions? One of the options allowed to add XML code, I think it is managed apps option. So again, that's a security setting. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of that because that's a standalone thing that would be determined by the policy. So you can certainly add it and put it in there. I don't see any issue. I haven't seen any issues with it. Again, that's more around the security of how you want to manage the apps on the device itself, and that's in the security settings rather than in the application management, which we're talking about now. So again, it certainly is possible, but it is in another area that we haven't covered as yet. Any other questions? Any other questions? Thumbs up. We're all good to take a quick break here again before we finish off for our last session for today. All right, I don't see any questions coming through, so why don't we do that? I'll start the clock again and get ready for the next demo. See you in 10.